So my name's Celia, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about all the ways that code reminds me of Latin, which it turns out is a little bit the story of my journey into tech. So where did I start with code? Even though I spent most of my time in the humanities, I've spent a lot of time kind of sort of looking sidelong at code and sighing wistfully, and I fell in with a disreputable crowd at university, so I was surrounded by engineering and natural language processing and Melbourne Uni puzzle hunts. But I was mainly playing with history and languages. Code has always been there, kind of alongside, but I've mainly stuck in my lane. And then I started work recently as a junior developer, and I've been looking around at all the amazing coders, and I've been kind of thinking, why did I spend all that time learning Horace and Virgil, and I have a story about this if I have time later, when I could have been learning Python and C? Why did I waste that time? But part of the reason I didn't... Oh shit, I've gone too far. Part of the reason that I didn't study code is because I've never had a plan in life. And I discovered Latin pretty early on, and I loved it. And so I followed Latin through. Later, someone asked me if I would like to teach Latin. I thought that was a great idea. I get to teach something I love to a whole bunch of other people. And then eventually, all good things come to an end, and I decided to leave teaching. And when you leave teaching, it can be a little bit difficult to convince a potential employer that you have transferable skills. But I was lucky enough to get a job in data. This is not a slide about data, but it gives you a good indication of how I feel about data. The job was amazing. I spent my days puzzling out why things had gone wrong, hunting down problems, finding things for people, but I got to a point where I knew there were things in the database that I couldn't see. There were patterns I couldn't quite see from the outside, and it was taking way too long between spotting an anomaly and finding someone to write an SQL report for me. So I started to play around with SQL myself. And it was like all the lights going on in my head. It filled me with the same unholy joy that Latin does. It has the same precision and the same ambiguity and the same stories and the same patterns. It was bliss to play with something that reminded me so much of Latin, but also unlocked all the secrets of our database. So why did I think SQL was like Latin? As well as how it makes me feel, there are some concrete examples. I've only got time to go through one today. And this is an example of an SQL statement. And in my head, this is a sentence. It reads like, select this ID from this table and that table, where the ID is 231 and the year is 2018. And this works the same way as a Latin sentence. It has a verb, a direct object, an ablative, a conjunction, another ablative, and a relative clause. Now, I'm sure you all know all this grammar already, but I hope you'll indulge me as I explain some of it to you, because I really love grammar. So we start off with verbs. Verbs, as most people will know, are doing words. Some examples of verbs are see, knit, climb, and select. We also have conjunctions, which are words that join things together. Examples of conjunctions are so and but. And we have direct objects and ablatives. Now, what are direct objects and ablatives? They are cases. So a case, and Latin nouns have cases, and if you've studied German or you've studied Greek, you might be familiar with this, and they indicate the role that the noun is taking in a sentence, and we do this in English with word order. So in English, man bites dog, you know who is biting and who has been bitten by the word order. If you switch it around, the sentence meaning changes completely. However, in Latin, via canem mordet and canem via mordet mean the same thing. The word order doesn't affect the meaning. And then canis virum mordet and virum canis mordet mean dog bites man, and it's not about the word order. It's the endings on the words showing you the case. I'm going to go a bit further into the cases. There are 7 in Latin, but we really only talk about 6 of them. And to demonstrate what they are, we will use the humble horse. Equus is the nominative case, and an example, it's a subject of the sentence. In this case, the horse runs. Equum is the accusative or direct object, and as an example, I see the horse. No? Okay. Equi is an example of the genitive, the possessive case. It shows what belongs to the horse. And again, this photo is a bit of a stretch, but I ran out of photos that were the right shape. So this is the horse's mouth. The horse also has a seagull, so it could be the horse's seagull. Equo is the dative, and the dative is an indirect object, and you don't need to worry about the dative too much. And it has a sense of transference, and you would usually translate the dative without any prepositions by to or for. So mum gives the apple to the horse as an example of the dative, and equo is the ablative. And ablative is also an indirect object, and without pronouns, prepositions, you would normally translate it as by, with, or from the horse. In this case, I leap with the horse, and if you can see this picture, I'm really only just leaping with the horse. The final one is a bit, we don't really use this much in English. Eque is the vocative. It's the version of the noun you use when you are speaking to someone or something. Oh, horse, bring me an apple. So now we come back to the SQL, and I hope you can see how I see this as a Latin sentence. You select the ID from this table and that table, the ablative, with a conjunction and I don't have enough time to talk about relative clauses in this talk, but if you want to know more about it, come and ask me after. I'm also skipping right over, so like this, any language can have a sentence construction like this, and there are things in code that are like things that grammar constructions that only happen in Latin. And I don't have enough time in this talk to talk about them, but if you want to come and find out about ablative absolute, my 3rd favourite grammar construction in Latin, come find me afterwards. So we skip right over that part, and we'll talk more about other things with Latin grammar that has really helped me with my coding journey. So the next stage was attending a Rails Girls Day, and I was surprised by someone warning me, don't worry about conditionals, they're really hard, it's okay if you don't understand. I was like, okay, that's fine. And then books that I was reading were reassuring me that conditionals were really hard, and online tutorials, and I wasn't finding them hard. And this is an example of a nested ternary, and you're advised not to do this because the logic can be hard to follow. But it felt okay to me, and it's because of Latin. Now, I've brought along a copy of my favourite Latin grammar book, and I've put in the slides the pages that deal with some of the cases of conditionals in Latin to give you an idea of how much Latin has helped me with conditionals in coding. So we start at page 376, and we keep going, and we keep going, and we keep going, and there's some more, and there's more, still more, and finally a half page more of conditionals. I'm not bothered by if statements because I have all of this behind me helping me with conditionals. And in fact, it's come in handy now that I've started my new job. And I realise that there's lots of steps between attending a Rails Girls Day and starting a new job. I'm just glossing over all of those. And we recently built an ETL process in Scala, and we had threaded synchronous and asynchronous code. This is just cute, right? And I realised that, again, Latin conditionals are helping me understand asynchronous coding. So to give you an example of one type of Latin conditional, let me put this down before a future less vivid is a conditional where you take 2 verbs in the present subjunctive in Latin, and you have a sentence that gives the sense of something that's possible but not likely to happen. So in this case, should the horse hide, I would look for the horse. It's not likely to happen though. And then also we have present contrary to fact. In this case, if the horse were hiding, I would find the horse, but because both the verbs in Latin are in the imperative subjunctive, it gives a sense of, like, the horse isn't hiding, so I won't find her. You can't do this in English, but like this is what you have to learn in Latin. So then when it came to asynchronous programming, we were building this in Scala, and we were using a library and for the asynchronous bit, and it explained that a future is something that might be completed and it's immutable once it's complete. And if a computation is incomplete, the future is incomplete. And if the computation is complete, the future is complete. And you either have a value, which is a success, or you have an exception, which is a failure. I am 100% okay with that because it's way simpler than the present contrary to fact and the future less vivid. There's also past contrary to fact. Doesn't matter. So there's another way that Latin has helped me. And it's helped me in my new job not to panic. One of the forms of assessment for Latin is the unseen. So you take a piece of original Latin literature and you give it to the student, and they have to translate it in a certain amount of time. And to explain why this is quite challenging, I'm going to back up a bit to explain how Latin is taught these days. What's the next slide? I'm a slide behind. At any rate, and you can see how old this unseen is. At the top there, 1963 Scottish Certificate of Education. And this is by no means the oldest version of an unseen. So in Latin, you don't speak Latin. There's no day-to-day Latin. It wasn't preserved for us. We don't know what it is. Well, except for graffiti. But the Latin graffiti that survives is not suitable for the classroom, and it's not suitable for this tech talk. Definitely something, if you feel like it, look up later. So there's no easy Latin. And a student once came to me and said, "Miss, last week in French, we learnt the colours, and we learnt 17 different ways to kill someone in Latin." I'm like, well, that's the nature of the beast. You start out with quite simple sentences. Troia erat oppidum magnum in Asia. Troy was a large city in Asia, which is actually Turkey. I have a side thing about that as well, which we'll come back to if there's time. But just quickly. So you move from the simple sentences to quite tricky sentences. During the early months of winter, Perseus hesitated to march out of Macedonia and leave his kingdom unprotected, fearing that the Romans would attack. And then from there you move into Latin literature. And Latin literature was written by elite Roman educated people to be read by elite Roman educated people, and they used rhetorical techniques and they used idioms and they pushed the boundaries of the language and they tried to show off for each other. So it's quite tricky language. It's a little bit like going from this is an array to build me toy robot to make me an ETL process. So back to the unseen. There's lots of advice on how to best do an unseen, and I've completely lost track of where I'm up to in my talk. Yes, so ideally, you know all the vocabulary that you need to know. You're well versed in all the grammatical forms, you've got a good grasp of the syntactical connections, and you're across all of the rhetorical techniques. You look at the name of the author, you consider what you know about their style, you look for references to towns or historical events to give you as much context as possible. You read it through several times, out loud if possible. And these things are actually things I've seen developers at work do when they come to new code. I've seen people read it out aloud. I've seen them find strings and like chase them down the rabbit hole through the code base. There's another side thing that we'll get to if there's time. And this is what you're supposed to do in an unseen if you've learned everything you need. So you read the passage, you understand the thoughts of the author, you figure out what they were trying to express, and then you write it down in the most beautiful, elegant English prose. And this is what I aspire to with code. I aspire to read code the way that I can read unscenes, but where I'm at as a junior developer, I'm much closer to my students who maybe weren't as committed to Latin as I would have hoped. So, like, sometimes they didn't pay attention all the time in class. Or maybe they watched all of Veronica Mars instead of learning their Latin vocabulary. Or maybe they hung out with friends instead of learning their Latin grammar. So I taught my kids some tricks, which turned out to be quite useful for any unfamiliar language. And I will talk about two of them quickly now. One of the tricks is to divide up the clauses. So in modern Latin that you give to students, the commas and the full stops are already in there. So you put a division through where there's a comma, you put a division through where there's a full stop. And ideas don't leak between sentences, and they don't really leak between clauses. So that gives you smaller units to deal with, which are much easier to translate than trying to look at the whole thing as one block. And you can do this with code as well. So if we go back to the nested ternary for FizzBuzz in Ruby, this is a really short bit of code, but if the logic is confusing you, you can still apply this idea, and you can divide at the colon, and divide, and then you've got three much smaller pieces. Four much smaller pieces to deal with. If the number is divisible by 3 and 5, return FizzBuzz. Then if the number is divisible by 3, return Fizz. And if the number is divisible by 5, return Buzz. And then finally, if none of those things are true, just return the number. So it's a way of simplifying. Another thing which I told my students to do was to be sensible. There's the word for grandfather in Latin is very similar to the word for bird. So if you have translated the sentence and you have grandfather sitting in a nest in a tree, you have to ask yourself how sensible you've been. And then I've got one final thought about code in Latin. And I can't quite work out how to demonstrate this, but I've had the opportunity to see some really great programmers at REA refactor code, and it reminds me of reading Latin poetry. It's beautiful, it's elegant, it says everything it needs to say and nothing more. The process of watching someone do this refactoring involves drama, and it involves narrative tension, and it involves choosing the path of the story or the code. And they're poets the way that Horace and Virgil are poets. And I haven't wasted anything because I got to revel in the poetry of Latin, and now I get to see poets at work, and I get to learn this new poetry. Thank you.